In the ancient world, names did not echo forever unless they were carved into time with fire, blood, and ambition. Most kings ruled, some conquered, a few changed history, but only one young man from Macedonia seemed to tear open the age itself and leave behind an empire so vast, so sudden, and so legendary that even death could not fully silence him. Alexander the Great. He was born in a world of spears and kings, where the fate of nations could change in a single afternoon. He was taught by Aristotle, inspired by heroes, and raised under the shadow of a father who forged Macedonia into a war machine. But Alexander was never meant to merely inherit power. He was meant to take the world by force. And for 13 years that is exactly what he did. This is the story of a boy who became a conqueror, a king who became a legend, and a man who, by the age of 32, had built one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. But behind the glory was something darker. A life of endless war, betrayal, grief, obsession, and a hunger so immense that it could never be satisfied. This is the life of Alexander the Great. Born for greatness, Alexander was born in 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedonia. At the time, Macedonia was not yet the unstoppable power it would become. It was a rising kingdom, fierce and ambitious, but still looked down upon by many of the Greek city-states to the south. His father was Philip II, one of the greatest military minds of the ancient world. Philip transformed Macedonia from a rough northern kingdom into a disciplined military empire. He built the powerful Macedonian phalanx, strengthened the cavalry, and conquered much of Greece through a combination of strategy, diplomacy, and force. His mother, Olympias, was equally unforgettable. She was passionate, intense, and deeply religious, and legends surrounded her even in her own time. She told Alexander that he was descended from heroes and gods. Whether those stories were true or not almost did not matter. Alexander grew up believing he was different from ordinary men. From the beginning, he was restless. He was intelligent, proud, bold, and difficult to control. Stories from his childhood already hint at the fire that would later consume him. One famous tale says that when he was young, he tamed the wild horse Bucephalus, a horse no one else could ride. While others saw an uncontrollable beast, Alexander saw an opportunity. He noticed the horse was afraid of its own shadow, turned it toward the sun, and mounted it successfully. Philip reportedly wept when he saw his son succeed, saying Macedonia was too small for him. That story may be embellished, but the meaning behind it is unmistakable. Even as a boy, Alexander was already looking beyond limits. His education was carefully shaped. Philip hired Aristotle, one of the greatest thinkers in history, to tutor his son. Under Aristotle, Alexander studied philosophy, science, medicine, literature, politics, and ethics. He learned to admire Homer, especially the Iliad, which would become one of the defining texts of his life. Alexander reportedly carried a copy of the Iliad with him on campaign, keeping it under his pillow with his dagger. He did not want only to rule. He wanted to be remembered like Achilles. The death of Philip in 336 BCE, Alexander's world changed forever. Philip II was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards during a public celebration. The murder shocked Macedonia. The motives behind it remained debated, and some suspected political conspiracy, personal revenge, or even family intrigue. Alexander was only 20 years old. In a single moment, the future of Macedonia fell into his hands, and he did not hesitate. The transition was dangerous. Rivals could have challenged him. Greek city-states might have rebelled. Foreign powers could have attacked. But Alexander acted with extraordinary speed. He secured his position in Macedonia, crushed opposition, and made it brutally clear that he would not be a weak king. Then he turned south to Greece. The Greek city-states had long chafed under Macedonian dominance. When Philip died, some thought the time had come to break free. They were wrong. Alexander moved with terrifying speed, restoring Macedonian authority before his enemies could unite. The most famous example was Thebes, which revolted against him. Alexander responded with merciless force. The city was destroyed. Thousands were killed. Others were sold into slavery. It was a message to the world. The new king was not his father. He was younger, faster, and perhaps even more dangerous. Crossing into Persia with Greece under control, Alexander turned toward the real prize, Persia. The Persian Empire was vast, ancient, and wealthy. It stretched from Asia Minor to Egypt, from the Mediterranean to the edges of India. It had humbled kings and armies for generations. Many believed it was too large, too powerful, too deeply rooted to be destroyed. Alexander did not believe in impossible odds. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with a relatively small army compared to the enormous resources of Persia. But his army was hardened, loyal, and led by a commander who understood momentum better than almost anyone in history. At the Granicus River, Alexander fought his first major battle against the Persians. It was a dangerous crossing, and victory did not come easily. But Alexander charged into combat personally, as he often would, risking his life to inspire his men. He survived, he won, and the road into Persia opened. One victory led to another. One city fell after another. Alexander moved like a storm. He was not simply fighting battles, he was dismantling an empire piece by piece. Yet even as he advanced, he was building something larger than conquest. Everywhere he went, he founded cities, installed administrators, and spread Greek culture. He did not just want to defeat Persia, he wanted to remake the world. The Gordian knot, one of the most famous stories in Alexander's life, comes from Gordium. According to legend, an ancient knot tied to a wagon was said to belong to a prophecy. Whoever could untie it would rule Asia. Many tried and failed. Alexander studied the knot briefly, then drew his sword and sliced through it. Whether the story is literally true matters less than what it reveals about his character. Alexander was not a man who waited for problems to be solved slowly. He believed that if a path was blocked, force could create a new one. The world would later remember that as genius. His enemies would remember it as danger. The Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, Alexander faced King Darius III of Persia at Issus. The Persian army was much larger, and Darius had the advantage of numbers. But terrain, timing, and Alexander's tactical brilliance changed everything. Alexander targeted the center, and Darius, seeing the tide turn against him, fled the battlefield. That moment transformed the war. A Persian king had run from a battle against a young Macedonian commander. The image spread like fire. Alexander's reputation became immense. Victory was no longer just possible, it seemed inevitable. But conquest is never clean. Behind the triumphs were cities destroyed, men slaughtered, families displaced, and a world increasingly bent under the weight of one man's ambition. Egypt and the making of a god. Alexander marched into Egypt and was welcomed as a liberator. The Egyptians, long oppressed by Persian rule, saw him as a better alternative. He was declared pharaoh, and he embraced the role with remarkable instinct. In Egypt, Alexander did more than conquer. He transformed himself. He founded Alexandria, which would become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, a center of trade, learning, and power. He traveled to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa, where he was reportedly told that he was the son of a god. Alexander needed no convincing. By now, his ambition was no longer merely political. It had become spiritual, almost divine. He did not simply want to be king of lands. He wanted to be king of history. Gaugamela and the fall of Persia. If Issus was a defining victory, Gaugamela was the crown jewel. In 331 BCE, Alexander faced Darius again in a battle that would decide the fate of the Persian Empire. Darius gathered a massive army, with chariots, cavalry, and even war elephants. The plain at Gaugamela was prepared for maneuver, and the stakes were enormous. Alexander studied the battlefield carefully. He used precision, timing, and formation to create openings. When the moment came, he launched his attack with devastating clarity. Once again, Darius fled. With that, Persian power collapsed. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis fell into Alexander's hands. He took the treasures of empire. He stood at the heart of the ancient world's wealth and authority. Yet his greatest triumph also revealed his greatest danger. At Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, Alexander allowed the palace to be burned. Some say it was revenge for earlier Persian attacks on Greece. Others say it was drunken excess. Whatever the reason, the flames became one of the defining symbols of his campaign. He had conquered an empire, and in doing so, he had begun to destroy a world. The road east, most conquerors stop when they have won what they wanted. Alexander did not. He pushed eastward into regions few Greeks had ever imagined. He marched through Bactria and Sogdiana, lands of harsh terrain, fierce resistance, and endless distance. Here, the war changed. It was no longer the swift clashes of open battle. It became a grinding struggle of sieges, raids, and resistance. It was also during this period that Alexander began to change. He adopted elements of Persian court customs. He wore foreign dress at times. He demanded forms of reverence that offended many of his Macedonian companions. He was trying, perhaps, to unite his empire through blending cultures. Or perhaps power had begun to convince him that he stood above ordinary customs altogether. The further he went, the more alone he became. He also married Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman, likely for political reasons and perhaps personal affection as well. But even marriage could not anchor a man who had made conquest his identity. The mutiny at the Hyphasis then came the edge of the world, or so it seemed. Alexander reached the river Hyphasis in India. He had crossed mountains, deserts, empires, and cultures. He had won glory beyond imagination. But his soldiers were exhausted. They had been campaigning for years. Many had no desire to march farther into lands of unfamiliar terrain and endless resistance. When Alexander tried to push onward, his men refused. This was one of the rare moments in his life when he could not force the world to bend. He raged. He pleaded. He stood before his army and tried to inspire them one more time. But they would not move. At last, he had no choice but to turn back. For Alexander, that decision may have been more painful than any wound. The return journey was disastrous. The army suffered through brutal terrain, hunger, thirst, and attacks. Alexander himself was nearly killed during the campaign in India, where he fought with reckless courage and was badly wounded. By the time he returned to Babylon, his empire was immense, but his body and spirit were worn down. He had conquered too much, too fast, and perhaps too alone. Then came the final days. In 323 BCE, Alexander died in Babylon at the age of 32. The exact cause remains uncertain. Some say fever. Some suspect poison. Others believe exhaustion and illness were enough. What is certain is that the man who had seemed untouchable was gone. His death shattered the empire almost immediately. Without him, no clear successor could hold it together. His generals, the Diadochi, fought over the remains. The great empire fragmented into rival kingdoms. The world Alexander had created survived in pieces, but never as one. What made him great? Alexander's greatness is not simple. He was brilliant, courageous, strategic, and visionary. He reshaped the ancient world through military genius and relentless drive. He founded cities, connected cultures, and spread Hellenistic influence across a vast territory. His campaigns changed politics, trade, language, and ideas for centuries, but he was also ruthless. Cities were destroyed in his name. Lives were lost by the tens of thousands. He was a king who could inspire loyalty and fear in equal measure. A man who pushed beyond every boundary until there were no more boundaries left. That is what makes Alexander so unforgettable. He was not merely powerful, he was consumingly ambitious. He did not just seek victory, he sought scale, permanence, and immortality. And yet in the end, time won. His empire broke apart, his body failed, his dream became history. But his name survived. Centuries later, we still speak of him as if he were not only a man but a force of nature, a storm in human form. A king who carried a dagger, a map, and a vision too large for the world he was born into. And maybe that is the real reason Alexander the Great still lives in memory. He reminds us that history is often shaped not by those who are content with what exists, but by those who look at the horizon and refuse to stop. He looked at a kingdom, then at an empire, then at the world, and he marched farther still.